Good evening. Thank you so much, Shirley and City Congregation, for inviting me to share a little bit about my book, Going South, Jewish Women in the Civil Rights Movement. I hope in this time of bondage, the stories of these women will inspire you as they did inspire me. And in the reading, I heard the phrase, acts of courage and kindness remain. And that was really my purpose in doing this research and writing this book. So we would not forget these women who were both ordinary and extraordinary. I'd like to start with just a little bit of background about why I wrote this book. I was in graduate school at a time when women of color were really challenging white women to look at their racism. And I was interested in finding women in my own tradition who walked the walk rather than just talk the talk. And so clearly Jewish women who put their bodies on the line to go south for civil rights were the women I wanted to talk to. And I thoroughly enjoyed the process of getting to know them. I don't have a lot of time today, 20 minutes. So what I'd like to do is start by giving you the tiniest bit of historical context, talk a little bit about who they were and why they decided to go south, a little bit about what they did, and then take your questions in whatever time we have. So, of course, you may know this historical context, but just keep in mind the timing, because the timing is quite astounding, really, if we think about the fact that the Holocaust, World War II and the Holocaust ended, as you all know, of course, in 1945, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the important organizations that I'll be talking about, was founded in 1960, only 15 years later. So those are two very important things to remember. And also from the perspective of women's history, this is a time in the mid 20th century US when Betty Friedan is writing her famous book, The Feminine Mystique, and talking about the constraints that particularly white middle-class women were feeling. And all of these contexts informed the decisions of the women that I studied to take the risk of going south. So tiny bit of historical context and a little bit of demographics. So essentially I found kind of two subgenerations of women that I studied. The first was a slightly older generation born in the 1910s and 1920s, probably similar to members of your family. Some history of involvement with the old left, community organizing, labor organizers, Jewish communal organizations coming out of that tradition. And then a slightly younger generation born between 1935 and 1943, the Great Depression and World War II. And they were more typical children and grandchildren of immigrants, Roosevelt Democrats, primarily from secular Jewish backgrounds and college educated, and that is often where they encountered the movement. So we'll think about those two cohorts. And Jewish women did many, many things in the civil rights movement. In a larger sense, they were organizers on campuses all over the country, fundraisers, demonstrators, desegregators, voter registration workers, freedom school teachers, lawyers, doctors, strategists, communications coordinators, economic food cooperative founders, typists, sympathetic listeners. All of these contributions have different kinds of meanings, but our focus will be specifically on those Northern Jewish women who made the decision and had the ability to go south for civil rights in the early 1960s. So was this a brave decision? Some of the challenges that these women faced were, first of all, disappointing their families, needing nice Jewish girls needing to defy their families, perhaps for the first time, who were clearly concerned and rightly concerned for their safety. They were going into a dangerous and violent time in the South. They also had to cross many cultural boundaries, negotiating differences that they had never encountered before. One of which was to deal with the complexities of being white women in a Southern movement led primarily by young African-American students and men primarily, although there were Black women leaders as well. So nonetheless, despite these challenges, these women did make the decision. And in the research, I found kind of three broad reasons that they cited for going south. A number of them had different relationships with either the Holocaust or personal encounters with racism and anti-Semitism. So they talked about that. The second group heard the call, heard a speaker coming back from the South, heard the call for Freedom Riders, and just felt like this was a historical moment that was absolutely irresistible and they must be involved. The third group had been sent to college to get an MRS degree. And when the women said that to me, I also had absolutely no idea, as my students do not know now, what they were talking about. But basically, the incomprehensible idea to my students today that you could be sent to college to find a husband. So a number of the women that I interviewed talked about, working very hard, coming to the end of their college education and not having a clear sense of what they were supposed to do, and seeking a meaningful way to engage with the world and to contribute. So those are kind of the three broad categories. And I will try to introduce you to just a few of them and a few of their stories to illustrate these things. The first person that I suspect who I'd like to talk about is Rita Schwerner Bender. So Rita Schwerner, as you probably know, was the wife of Mickey Schwerner, one of the people who was killed in June of 1964, prior to the beginning of the Freedom Summer. But they had both been activists in CORE in New York City, and they made a very brave move to go to Mississippi in January of 1964 to open a community center in Meridian, Mississippi. And it was there that Mickey would go out into the community to try to build relationships, and Rita would be there setting up the community center and answering the phone and getting horrible calls about how the Klan was going to get their communist, Bolshevik, troublemaking outsider from New York husband. And she endured that for 6 months, helping to lay the foundation for what would become Freedom Summer. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. As you know, the volunteers heard about the disappearance of the three workers, James Chaney, Mickey Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, right in the middle of the training in Oxford, Ohio. So anybody who did subsequently decide to go down to Mississippi understood that they were taking a very brave, they were risking their lives and making a very brave decision. They were offered the opportunity to leave and nobody left. So a very pivotal moment, but also thinking about the time frame of Rita Schwerner's commitment, terrible tragedy. She lost her husband. It took her and others 41 years in a fight for justice to see one person, although there was a conspiracy involved in these murders, but at least one person. In 2005, Edgar Ray Killen was convicted and sent to jail for the murders. And Rita herself went on to become a lawyer later in life, and really translated that pursuit of justice into her work. So even Rita, a very fierce warrior, had the thought about saving herself from the feminine mystique. And she said, when I asked her why she went, I had no vision of saving anyone except perhaps of saving myself from a split level house in the suburbs. So I was very surprised to hear her say that. And I thought it was great that she did say it, because I think it's important to be able to have a complexity of motives. I think all of us have those complicated motives for activism and for doing what we do. So I appreciated that. Another broad category, as I mentioned, were close encounters with anti-Semitism, racism, and more specifically, the Holocaust. So one of my interviewees of that older generation, who sadly is no longer with us, is a wonderful woman named Trudy Orris, who was born in 1916 in New York. She was a labor organizer in the garment industry at a very young age. She became a wife and mother to two children who would themselves become very committed civil rights activists who went south. But as a good wife, at the end of World War II, her husband was an army doctor who was asked to be stationed in Germany. So despite her extreme discomfort, she joined him in Germany at the end of the war. And because of their work, they had to participate in meetings and social gatherings. And she found herself at a table with a German musician one night. And as was her practice, she said, "And what did you do during the war?" With a bit of a chip, perhaps, on her shoulder. And the man that she was speaking to said, "If you're asking me if I was a coward, I was a coward. My best friend was taken away and I did nothing about it. But let me ask you something. What are you going to do when your turn comes?" And Trudy felt that very deeply and made an internal personal commitment that when she returned to the United States, she would get involved in the nascent, at that point, civil rights movement. She did go on to participate with her children in sit-ins, and then became a founder of the group New York Parents of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that was an important and less visible contribution, where African-Americans organizers who were really on the front lines and facing a lot of violence would come up to New York and receive medical attention, get a break, participate in the process of raising funds and gaining support for the organization. So there were a lot of stalwarts in New York City, parents who were supporting as well in that older generation. So as we said, this whole idea of the MRS degree and not knowing what to do with one's skills after graduating college was a key motivator or a key force weighing on the minds of these women. Future lawyer Jan Goodman said, "I did a lot of house cleaning as a child. I did not see cleaning the house as an occupation." So yet this idea of doing work was not unfamiliar to the Jewish tradition, right? So historically, in Eastern European culture, we know that often Jewish women worked outside the home, managing businesses, managing families, so that men could study Torah. So they were used to being competent, making contributions. Many of the civil rights activists that I interviewed had working mothers, which was relatively unusual for that mid-century moment. And some of the women themselves were professionals. So some of the pioneers in their fields as doctors, lawyers, professors, teachers. And one of the things that really facilitated these Jewish women's involvement in the civil rights movement was their willingness to do the less glamorous work and not to have to be in front, not to have to get the recognition. So a number of them spoke about that as doing what needed to be done. So that was an entree into the movement. The other dynamic was hearing a speaker or hearing something about the sit-ins, the very early activities of the 1960 civil rights movement. Once the sit-ins started in Nashville and Greensboro, North Carolina, they set off a very large wave of sit-ins across the South, and then students in the North started to get involved. So in 1960, another New Yorker, Dorothy Miller, heard about the sit-ins. She was a Queens College graduate, the editor of her school paper, a very good writer, and she just wanted to get involved. So not really knowing anything, but hearing that CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, was giving a training, she went down to this training in Miami and immediately was arrested and was the only white woman of her group who were arrested. And so being in jail as a 22-year-old was her first experience. And although it was challenging, she felt she absolutely could not return to the North. This was where she belonged. This was the movement for her. So she talked to people and asked them, you know, how can I remain involved? And they said the organization to go to is SNCC. So she found her way to the SNCC Atlanta office, which was about the size of half of the room that you were seeing me in. Dirty, chaotic, small, underfunded. But the executive director of SNCC at that time, a man named James Foreman, asked her if she could type. And rather than being upset that this was a stereotypical question to ask a woman, she was thrilled. And he set her to work immediately, doing things that, again, might not be the most glamorous things, but were very essential to holding together a small, underfunded group doing very dangerous work on the front lines. So since it's May Day and we're celebrating work, what kind of work am I talking about? She typed affidavits from the field secretaries who were returning from organizing in rural areas in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, etc. And also womaned the Watts line, meaning that she fielded calls. There was a methodology that everybody who went out to do work in the field had to call in by a certain time. And if they did not call in, as Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney did not call in on that fateful day in June of 1964, then there was a protocol where they immediately notified local police, the national media, radio, the FBI, and if necessary, the Justice Department. So that was saving lives. Also, just in the work of documenting all of this activism, she was essentially documenting history from a war zone. And she also became an editor with Julian Bond of the Student Voice, which was SNCC's newspaper. And it's hard for us, again, in the day of Zoom and immediate knowledge of what's happening all over the world, to really understand that at that point in 1960, much of the rest of the country had no idea of what was going on, the violence that was going on in the South. And so the Student Voice was an important source for that kind of information for the movement, but for people outside the movement as well. So all of these things were for her absolutely meaningful and thrilling. And she said at the time, what enabled her to work in this environment. And she said, I was under no illusions from the outset that I was in charge. I knew perfectly well who was in charge, and I was very honored and happy to be allowed to be there. And that kind of attitude facilitated the work of Jewish women in SNCC offices, and also those who remained in the North and were supporting the efforts of the movement in the South. Someone who heard the call on the radio and felt stirred within her soul to take action was a woman named Ruth Silver. She was a University of Chicago graduate who decided to work at the United Nations for a year before starting law school. And while she was there, at the time that Nikita Khrushchev was banging his shoe on the table and criticizing the hegemony of the United States in international affairs, and that gave her an opportunity to start to think about, well, maybe it's possible to be critical of my own country, and looking around and formulating her own ideas about this country and what was going on. And at that moment, she heard a call on the radio for more freedom riders. And she responded immediately. She said, I felt it was a call to me personally. I could not say no. So she actually responded at a very early moment. As I think some of you know, the freedom rides were an effort to desegregate interstate travel on buses. And the riders rode together in interracial pairs and stopped at various points along the way in the states, the southern states, and with the goal of reaching New Orleans. The first group of riders never reached New Orleans because they met incredible violence particularly in Anniston, Alabama, where one of the buses was set on fire. So anybody who was responding to a call, and at that moment, the big leaders like Dr. King and James Farmer of CORE were very afraid of this violence and wanted to shut down the freedom rides. And it was really the students of Nashville, of SNCC, led by Congressman John Lewis now and Diane Nash, who said, if you stop the freedom rides now, that will completely invalidate the philosophy and practice of nonviolence. So they vowed themselves to continue the ride, and they put out a national call for freedom riders, and 300 people responded. Ruth Silver was one of those. And anyone who responded after that first call went out had to know that they were committing, potentially, of course, to facing violence, but also to spending the summer in jail in Mississippi, in a very infamous place called Parchman Penitentiary, which had originally been a plantation, and even in 1961 was still replicating the social relations, of course segregated, but also replicating the social relations of slavery and segregation, and very brutal experience. And Carol was in a segregated cell, so Black men and women, Black women, gender segregation, racial segregation. Carol was in a small cell, 13 by 15 foot cell, with 13 other white women freedom riders, half of whom were Jewish, which was very interesting. And she spoke about having a kind of existential crisis or an internal conflict when speaking with some of the Black women freedom riders who had been kind of harassed while in jail, and spoke about turning the other cheek and the Christian ethic of nonviolence. And Carol said, you know, as a Jew who had the impulse to fight back, it was really hard for her. So that was an early moment where the clash of religions, cultures, etc., was apparent in her own experience. Okay, so we talked about two of the compelling reasons that the women cited for making this decision to go south. And the third one is really having the skills to contribute through work, and having the willingness to put their bodies on the line and taking the opportunities. And particularly the 1964 Freedom Summer, as I think many of you may know, was a kind of desperate effort. The civil rights movement, the classic civil rights movement, had been in operation for 4 years, let's say, since the founding of SNCC in 1960. A lot of violence. Medgar Evers had been assassinated, other deaths, lesser known people. And there was a feeling that change still had not happened on a national level that was worth all of the sacrifices. So they decided to, and there were huge debates internally in the organization, but there was a decision to bring down 1,000 white Northern volunteers to work in Mississippi in the summer of 1964. And among those, obviously, that gave an opportunity to white students, white people in general, white women in general, and a subset of those people were some of the Jewish women that I interviewed. And in Freedom Summer, there were three major projects. There was voter registration, the Freedom Schools, and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. We don't have time to go into the latter, but thinking about community organizing and the Freedom Schools, let me share the experiences of two women, also of two different generations, but who spoke very compellingly about their experiences. One of them was Vivian LeBerg, who was herself the child of refugees fleeing the Nazis. Her parents fled Berlin for the Netherlands, and then ended up in New York and moved to California. And Vivian spoke about growing up in a community of refugees, seeing numbers on arms, and just being very aware of what the stakes were and could be. So again, when she heard the call for Freedom Summer, she felt, she was very young, I think she was 19, she felt she had to go down, and she was given an assignment to open a SNCC office by herself in a place called Leake County, Mississippi. The closest store was 5 miles away. The closest town was 25 miles away. The office was a shack that had been vacated because its owner died. She had a water pump and an outhouse, and that was it for the office. And because the only place that many of the workers could be safe, because they were seen as race traitors, if you were a white activist, they had to live in the Black community. And Vivian stayed with one Black family. She slept on their porch. The Klan started riding around the community, and she slept with a rifle next to her. And that was clearly a transformative experience. And she said, speaking about many women who went through that, I learned a lot of respect for myself. from that experience. And it's interesting to note that Vivian would go on to become one of the very important founders of Chicago women's liberation, and really a major influence on the women's liberation movement, and has remained a community organizer all of these years. It's still very committed. So she was one of the younger generations. Representing the older generation were people who worked in the freedom schools, for example, someone like Florence Howe. And again, Vivian's assignment was relatively unusual for a woman. So in the gender division of labor, women often got assigned to the freedom schools. But the freedom schools were extraordinarily important because they empowered young people, young African-American people, local community people with African-American history that they had never learned, even though they were living on the soil of this history, practical skills that were empowering, and of course, how to register to vote, and an understanding of why all of these Northerners were invading their state and what the meaning of the movement was, and the opportunity to think critically for themselves about what it meant to them and what they wanted to contribute. And Florence Howe, who actually was a professor at Goucher College and went to Mississippi at the urging of her own students, reflected very much on her experience as an educator, wrote about it, and in as early as 1965, she published an article, and she said, "All education is political. In Mississippi, at least, it is impossible to find this trait." And from that insight, eventually she became one of the founders of the women's studies movement and a creator of something called the Feminist Press, which some of you may know, which really published rescued the classic works of many women writers and published many critical texts, helping the field of women's studies to develop. So we see that continuity between movements. Bernice Johnson Reagan called the civil rights movement the morning struggle, which gave birth to subsequent movements, especially and including the women's movement. So as you know, one of the things that happened in the summer of 1964 was the passage of the Civil Rights Act, but it still did not fully enfranchise African Americans. So there was a recognition of the need for a Voting Rights Act. And the 3 marches in Selma in the following summer of 1965 were kind of pivotal to what would eventually be the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But again, as in the Freedom Rides, as you, I think, know, the famous images from the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the first attempt to march from Selma to the Capitol to demand voting rights was met with tremendous violence. And so there was a need to rethink, and a call went out again for people all over the country to come in and support a new march, which would be led by Dr. King. And among those people who came actually preceding the march was Dr. June Feiner, who was born in London during the Blitz. So she had that consciousness of World War II within herself, and she came to the US and became a medical doctor and what served as the Southern coordinator for the Medical Committee for Human Rights. And they set up offices in Selma, Montgomery, and Baton Rouge to prepare for this kind of major wave in Alabama. And not only were they there for the demonstration, but they went around and interviewed public health officials and local doctors to understand their attitudes about African Americans and their communities, and tried to educate people about the needs of that community, and provided health education in church groups to young people. So really trying to impact not just the very historic march from Selma to Montgomery, but really making change at the community level. And if I was showing you images, I would show you one of my favorite images from my book, which is of Dr. June Feiner sitting at the center of a circle of marchers, all of whom look very tired, and she's kind of turning and bandaging feet. It's a really beautiful picture that just captures the moment. But also, I think if we're talking about women's work, also, I mean, she was a medical doctor. There were women who did different kinds of caring work in other ways that I think needs to be part of what becomes visible in our understanding of women's contribution to the civil rights movement. So there are many more stories that I would like to share with you, many more wonderful women. But I will end here so that we have an opportunity to take your questions. And I just want to say that, you know, we're in this very strange time. And even before the pandemic, we started to see the rise of racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia. We see totalitarianism around the world. We see proto-fascism. All of these isms are not merely words. They are happening. And the question always arises, you know, how can we respond? What are we going to do? What is our responsibility as Jewish people? And I am very inspired by the words of one of the women I interviewed, Barbara Jacobs-Haber, who was fortunate enough to be at the founding meeting of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And she said, when I interviewed her, I saw the civil rights movement as the moral equivalent of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. To me, what it meant to be a Jew was never again. But what never again meant was not never again only to Jews, but never again to let this happen to anybody. So I leave you with that. I offer many more stories of the women in my book, Going South. It's available from NYU Press and probably through Amazon. And in addition to inspiration, I hope you will grow to love the women as much as I do. And they are incredibly funny, as well as wise, complicated, and curmudgeonly. So thank you for letting me share just a little bit of their story. And I look forward to hearing your comments and questions. Thanks.
So I will, first of all, that was amazing. I'm going to unmute everyone so we can applaud you.